All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Digital Equity Assembly. We are thrilled that you all were able to register and join us this morning for this important conversation. My name is Nathaniel Borick. I am an Outreach and Administrative Associate with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Community Development and Regional Outreach Department. And we'd like to first and foremost thank our partners at the, back one slide, thank you, at the Penn State College of Agricultural Sciences Center for Economic and Community Development and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. They're both integral to planning and hosting these important sessions, and we greatly appreciate their input and efforts. On the next slide, you'll see that our panel today is on the topic of digital equity for infrastructure, technology, and skills. That'll begin at 10 a.m. We'll have time for Q&A with the panelists towards the end of the hour. And then on the next slide, you'll see at 11 a.m., we're going to break out into small groups and discuss feedback and inputs on what the panelists presented, as well as opportunities for increasing capacity or helping to reduce barriers to building out access for digital equity programming broadly. And then at 11:25, we'll come back and report out a summary of each breakout group. And on the next slide, you'll see that, as always, the information, analyses, and conclusions set forth are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. Please share your name and organization, and I'm sure we're all used to it by now. Please enable your video if you're able to, and please, be prepared to ask questions in the chat or by raising your hand. We're glad to have you participate and interact and engage. And on the next slide, be sure to mute yourself, otherwise we might mute you. Today's assembly is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Also, your input and feedback is important. Please take our evaluation and let us know what's working well with these series, what could be better, what topics we could address, and what opportunities there might be to increase capacity to address this challenging issue. Also, lastly, the next assembly is scheduled for June 22nd, and it is on regional workforce models. There'll be a link to registration for that in the chat. We strongly encourage you to register and to share it among your networks. So again, thank you all for joining. We greatly appreciate you participating today, and I am excited to hand it over on the next slide to our panel and our moderator, Ashley Putnam, the Director for the Economic Growth and Mobility Project for the Philly Fed. Ashley, thank you so much for being here today and for moderating this important panel conversation.
Thank you, Nathaniel, for having me. And I am so excited to be here with just such an excellent group of experts on a really critical and important topic. So thank you all for joining and for participating in today's Rural Community Action Assembly. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and also something that I think has really become a critical conversation during the pandemic, which probably should have been a critical conversation prior to the pandemic. So by means of introduction, I direct the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, which is a strategic initiative of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And I get to sit at the intersection of several important pieces of our work, which is the research we conduct on the economy, on what's happening in communities, and the things we hope to see moving forward in those communities. So the real goal of the Economic Growth and Mobility Project is to help bring that research to bear on critical economic issues and to produce research that can inform action, so we can think about what we could do, what solutions look like for the economy. So we call these engagements Research in Action Labs. And we have been engaged in a Research in Action Lab for almost 2 years now, since the start of the pandemic, on this very topic, which is really about digital equity and digital inclusion. And the reason this came up, of course, is that we were doing some research. And so I'm excited to share some of the research we've conducted on broadband access as well as computer access and what it means for labor market participation. And of course, we do see some strong correlations, although we cannot infer causation, between people who have access to broadband enabled computers, as well as people who have access to high-speed internet, and whether or not those people are able to participate in our labor market fully. And so, of course, we're talking in a really critical economic moment, right? We are here in a time where we hear a lot about the labor shortage. We hear a lot about the Great Resignation. We hear a lot about businesses really trying to seek talent and bring people back into the labor force. But we know that the broadband access and digital divide goes beyond just access to devices. We know that this also includes conversations about digital literacy. We know this also includes conversations about computer education throughout one's lifespan. And we also know that digital divide may block you from accessing things beyond just a job. It could be access to healthcare services, access to critical needs throughout your life. So I'm really excited today to moderate this important conversation and to kind of uplift some of the work that we have been doing. Nathaniel has been just a great partner in this work as we've been thinking about how we can begin to think about digital solutions. What are people doing? What's working? What's been successful? So I'm excited to turn it over to our panel today, and my apologies because the run of show is a little bit slow here. I really am excited for this discussion and for you all to learn from the group of experts that we've brought together. And I believe I'm turning it over to Sasha, is that correct? I apologize, guys, my agenda is a little bit slow here.
Jeremy Higley is up first.
Thank you, Nathaniel, thank you. I'm having trouble with my documents on the backside here. So as we sit here and talk about the digital divide, of course, it would make sense that I am the person who's having internet issues this morning. So Jeremy has just been such an incredible partner, one of our partners from the Federal Reserve System. Really, I would say probably one of the first advocates lifting up this issue, and has in many ways been helping to teach and guide me and Nathaniel as we start our work on the digital divide in Pennsylvania. So Jeremy, very excited to turn it over to you to share a little bit about what you've been doing as we kick off this conversation.
Great. Good morning, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I want to start with a bit of a background that I think might be a good way to cue up the conversation, how we might frame this topic. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So recently the Federal Reserve System published a book called Investing in Rural Prosperity. And for that, I submitted a chapter on the role that philanthropy can play in bridging the digital divide. And some of this, actually, the work for this chapter actually began previous to the pandemic, and it was a result of having conversations with folks that said, you know, I understand the digital divide is a big issue, but I work for a foundation and we can't just give $1 million grant to extend a broadband network. And so I started looking around both our district and the rest of the country, and discovered that there were some things that foundations were doing, that philanthropy was doing. And this is the part that I think is relevant to today's conversation. The philanthropists that were contributing to solutions each recognized that they had to think creatively about how to support their community, and they weren't going to be able to give that $1 million grant to extend a broadband network. And so there's one example of at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, rural community foundation with serving a county of about 70,000 people that decided they were willing to make an impact investment. So taking some of their investments and using those to provide a low interest loan of about $200,000 to an internet service provider that they could use as a match for some federal funding. They were able to inject requirements that there be an affordability component there, able to then leverage some relationships to get some workforce development training grants, because this internet service provider would be providing, creating some new jobs. And so altogether, they were able to support their community, which was their mission, make a low interest loan, and then also using the relationships to bring in some other dollars. There are other examples in the chapter of community foundations starting very early with providing a $5,000 or $10,000 grant to help a community, maybe it's a community librarian or someone in the community, have some funding to allow them to start convening stakeholders, so they could start mapping out what their community needed, both in terms of infrastructure, but then also in terms of digital access and training and computers. So, and I think that's really important as we start thinking about looking forward with some of the upcoming funding, that we each start thinking about what are the unique resources that we have and the unique tools that we have, and who we can partner with that might have some complementary tools. So if we could go on to the next slide. This is a quick rundown, and I know there's a lot of words there, but we do have sources for this. But this is a quick rundown of what we have in the works coming at us from the federal government. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to highlight a couple of things that are unique with how the federal government is funding solving the digital divide now versus the way it used to work. Traditionally, the funding was for broadband, for the infrastructure, pretty much only for the infrastructure. Actually, if we can go back for a second, thank you. What's different this time is that funding is going to be going, instead of going from the federal government to the internet service providers, it will be going to the states. You might think of it as, you know, the way we used to think of block grants. And so for that, it's great because states will have more say in how those funds are deployed, although they'll have to stick with some requirements from the federal government. But it also means they're ramping up and they're going to be adding staff to deploy funds in ways that they haven't done before. And so there's going to definitely be a need for our state governments, our state broadband offices to have some support from community partners as they start figuring out how to deploy this. Something else that's unique is that for the first time, the federal government is putting significant dollars into digital equity. So beyond ensuring that the broadband is there, ensuring that it is affordable, ensuring that folks have the skills and the tools to utilize it. And so that's through the digital equity program. There's also some funding that goes directly to the tribes, although they can still get some of those other dollars up above there, and some funding for middle mile programs. So again, the two big things that are different here is that funding is going to states, so states will need to ramp up, and then also funding for digital equity inclusion. Now, if we could go to the next slide, I want to explain a little bit about how those digital equity dollars are coming down the pike. So Ntca just released on May 13th the program guidelines for the funding that will go to states. So a little over half of the funding will go to states. They'll be required to develop a plan. They'll get a planning grant to map out a statewide digital equity plan. That's something that's new to most all states. There are a couple of exceptions. And then once those plans are developed and accepted by the federal government, which is through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, then states can get their share of almost 1.5 billion to develop digital equity programming over the course of 5 years. So it's not all going to be tomorrow, but it's in the works. Once that is underway, then there's another 1.25 billion that will be competitive grants that can go to a wide variety of organizations working to end the digital divide without having to go through the states for that funding. And if we can go to the next slide, here's a little bit of a timeline. That's a lot of information here. There's two things I would like you to take from this slide. First is that things are already underway. So for the BEAD, which is a big infrastructure piece, and the digital equity piece, states are in the process of submitting their letter of interest saying that they want to apply for those funds and receive those funds. So that's coming now. What the other end of the spectrum is, you'll see on the right that these are, it's a 4-year implementation for the infrastructure. It's a 5-year plan altogether for the digital equity work. And so we should not expect that this is all going to come overnight, but things are underway and we need to start preparing for that. So in the light of preparing for this, I'm happy to share that the Philadelphia Fed, the Kansas City Fed, and several other Federal Reserve banks are already have already mapped out some training workshops for those state employees that will be responsible for creating those digital equity plans. The good news is there's a lot of work that we know through the program guidelines that have just been released. And I think some of that information is being dropped in the chat. And so there's work that we can be doing today to start putting the pieces together for those digital equity plans. The Federal Reserve System is working to support our states, our state government folks in doing that. And there's definitely a role for everyone on this call, I think, to play. And so with that, it looks like I think I'm about at time. I know that was a lot of content. So definitely, if you're interested in any of that, the links to all that information have been dropped in the chats. I would encourage you to look at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has created a few blog posts that outline their take on the BEAD program. That's an infrastructure piece, and also the Digital Equity Act piece, and actions that we can start taking right away. So, but one final thing is what is exciting, but also a challenge, is that we have the opportunity to start bringing in federal dollars to the digital equity aspect of this. That's relatively new versus just paying for the infrastructure piece. That's the exciting piece, but it also means that this is new for our states. And so we all have a role to play to ensure that that funding is deployed effectively. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, which is Roxana.
I'm just going to make a quick comment here as we're going. I know there's a lot of great content, and if you have questions, I wanted to encourage you to ask questions in the chat. Obviously, I have some questions for our panelists here as well, but we really do want to hear from all of you, and particularly folks in the great state of Pennsylvania who have been engaged with us in our research and action lab work. I see some of you on this call, and I'm really excited for us to dig in a little more on some of the opportunities that Jeremy is bringing to us across the Federal Reserve System. So with that, we'll turn it over to Roxana.
Thank you, Ashley. Are you able to hear me? Perfect. Yeah, so my name is Roxy Barboza, Ntca's Industry and Cybersecurity Policy Analyst, overseeing a few of our issues here at Ntca. And one of the issues that I've been blessed to have been working on for a couple of years has been digital equity and inclusion. And so in this presentation, I'll be presenting on the role that small service providers can play in community efforts to increase digital inclusion, followed by what we are doing here at Ntca to encourage our members to go above and beyond, and also highlight some of our member efforts and all the good work that they're doing. And so can we go on to the next slide, please? Start off to answer, the big question is the primary role for providers is to build community partnerships, right, in the community to bridge the gaps between access and adoption. And so here at Ntca, we are an association. It stands for the Rural Broadband Association. And so we are representing nearly 850 independent, family-owned, and community-based telecommunication companies, serving nearly 35% of the nation's landmass and less than 5% of its telecom subscribers. On average, Ntca member companies' customer density is approximately 7 subscribers per square mile, and our members have been active in these community partnerships. And so a couple of our digital inclusion efforts have included writing a white paper on the rural imperatives in broadband adoption and digital inclusion. And so in this white paper, we've highlighted the statistics of the adoption rates and how they're increasing, but just because they're increasing doesn't mean that our efforts stop now, right? And so that it was the white paper that we pushed out last summer. And most recently, we pushed out Ntca's Digital Inclusion Series. And so just an overview of this series, to help Ntca members in their efforts, we have created this series, right, which is a comprehensive guide consisted of 4 components that are designed to work together to help companies, to help improve companies' digital inclusion posture. And so the first part is the fundamentals of digital inclusion. And so This covers commonly used terms and offers examples of Ntca, of how Ntca members have encouraged digital inclusion in the communities. Part 2 has been developing digital inclusion initiatives. And so this provides steps that rural broadband providers can take to develop digital inclusion initiatives, such as seeking strategic partnerships, conducting a needs assessment, participating in community asset mapping, and designing specific programming. And so the reason for part 2 being is more of like, we may have the best ideas in the whole wide world, right? But if we're not here asking the community what they want and their needs, then how are our digital inclusion efforts gonna, improve their lives or even be of benefit, right? And so getting more of the scope of the land, part 3 is delivering digital inclusion initiatives. And so this part 3 does dive deep into how the specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, which is long for SMART, goal framework can be effective strategy for helping companies achieve digital inclusion principles and deliver meaningful initiatives. And then part 4, of course, is more of the whole case studies that we are conducting with our members and seeing where they're at when it comes to digital inclusion and the whole process that they've taken on to push out those efforts in their community. And so another thing that we have for our members is a digital inclusion resource webpage. And so this is more of providing them tools for members to use, such as the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program Consumer Outreach Toolkit, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and Microsoft State Digital Equity Scoreboard, and of course, NTIA's DI resources. And so this resource page is being updated on a weekly basis, so our members can take part of these efforts and be of a resource, right, for these states as these grants are coming in. Another thing that we are doing here at Ntca is we are part of the Diversity and Equity Working Group under the FCC's Communications, Equity, and Diversity Council. I know that those are a lot of words, but basically, this working group proposes solutions and approaches on how the FCC can affirmatively advance equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity in the telecom industry to address inequalities in the workplace, employment policies, and programs. And so one of our members, who is Mona L. Thompson, who is general manager at CRST Telephone Authority, is part of that. And I am more than happy to continue working with her on these efforts. And so these are some of the efforts that we are doing here at the Rural Broadband Association. And so I will turn it to the next page. And so I did want to highlight some of our digital inclusion case studies, specifically very member focused, right? And so, here at Ntca, we are committed to driving growth and creating opportunities for their communities. And so they have done so, excuse the background noise, but they have done so by excelling in their digital inclusion efforts with the help of strategic partnerships. And so, for example, Focus Broadband, which is located in North Carolina with a population of 4,205, they have partnered with local county public libraries to create digital inclusion plans for the communities that they are serving. And so what they did is that they surveyed residents about their internet usage, service tiers used, and provider information. And so the Focus Broadband also supported virtual fitness classes for seniors in the county during the pandemic. Another example is Home Telecom. And so they are located in South Carolina with a population of 11,000. And so they partnered with the public school district to provide free internet to households with school age children in low performing schools. And so they have also invested in the infrastructure updates as well in support of this initiative. Another example has included Horry Telephone Cooperative, which is in South Carolina as well, with a population of 24,000. They have worked with community organizations, identified respective issues of predominant interest. So more of like engaged with the whole part 2 part of the series when it comes to evaluating the community, and then based off of that, tailoring their digital inclusion curriculum on that. And so they've done financial management workshops, telehealth on those type of things, and even introductions to broadband programs. And then last but not least is Sacred Women of Communications, which they are located in New Mexico with a population of 627. They have partnered with Microsoft, creating a website where their customers could access resources and information. And so these resources range from health resources, Navajo culture, youth development, to even employment resources. In addition, they have partnered with a career academy to provide internet access for students during the COVID pandemic. And so these are some of the efforts that are being taken here at Ntca, and of course, working alongside with our members and assisting them along the way. And yeah, and that's everything on my end. And now I'll pass it on to Sasha.
Great. Thank you so much, Roxy. And we have Sasha joining us. Can you hear us okay, Sasha?
Indeed.
All right.
Should I jump in?
Go ahead. We're ready for you.
Alrighty. So hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Meinrath. I am the director of XLab, which is a policy institute, a think tank, if you will, working on a lot of the technological underpinnings of modern society. And I split my time between working inside the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., and here in State College, Pennsylvania, where I'm the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State. And I bring this up because I've been working on these issues now for, I guess now a little over 20 years. So I started building networks, broadband infrastructure, community broadband networks at turn of the millennia, which is to say I have found an infinity of creative ways to fail at these projects, and from there learned kind of how to build systems, business models that work, and also learned from there how important the policy realm was to on-the-ground successes. And so it's really exciting to hear about Roxy and all of the work that her member constituents are doing, because that is very much the future. But it also comes out of this really rich history. This is the third phase of an ongoing kind of government acknowledgement of the extent of the problem faced in the United States. So back in the 90s, we had something called the Technology Opportunities Program. That was spun up in order to start addressing the then digital divide. And it was sort of a modest effort, but a lot of us cut our teeth helping run, for example, community technology centers. And that program was spun up, invested in, and then they sort of dropped it like a hot potato. Fast forward a number of years to 2009, you end up with the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program being spun up, where we invest through Ntca at least $4.7 billion in broadband build-out. That program is stood up, modest investments made, and then dropped like a hot potato. Here we are a dozen years later, and now we're making a $40-odd billion investment through Ntca. And again, I don't want to downplay the importance of these programs, but I do want to underscore the total lack of adequate resourcing of these programs. When you actually look nationally at the need, we're not actually needing 40 billion. It's more like 400 plus billion in broadband infrastructure build out, which is to say all of these three phases are gearing up for a much larger necessary intervention. And so I want us to think about what this means to be amidst history, but also to be at this moment where we have an opportunity to document not just the state of the realm today, but what works and what doesn't work. And this has been missing for the last 20 years from this entire endeavor. So when you look historically, in 2010, we create this national broadband plan, we declare aspirationally to achieve a bunch of goals by 2020 that we completely missed. And we missed it because we didn't actually have a national strategy or, in fact, an actual national broadband plan. But one of the things that was spun up as part of this plan was an acknowledgement that we needed to actually document what was happening on the ground. And so we created the first national broadband map. And I was involved inside the belly of the FCC in developing methodologies, being overruled on these methodologies, publicly cautioning that not following good scientific practice would lead to a really poor national broadband map. And when the map came out, being the first public interest individual to call it a boondoggle. Well, we won that battle. 12 years later, we all acknowledge this national broadband map sucks. It doesn't really tell us anything useful for on-the-ground connectivity or planning purposes, and it's all being revamped. This becomes incredibly important because the distribution of today's $40-odd billion from Ntca is all predicated on the next generation of national broadband maps that are using a methodology that thus far has been completely black box, not peer reviewed by the scientific and research community, and that I'm hoping will be a giant leap forward. And I'm fearful that corners will be cut, compromises made, such that we end up with kind of a new kerfuffle in the mix. So all of this is really coming to the fore right now. And that's exciting, thrilling, depressing, however you want to look at this. But in essence, this down payment that we're making today and over the next half decade, $40 billion in broadband infrastructure build out, will be really poorly spent if we don't collect baseline information that's accurate and precise. If we don't know what the need looks like, and because we don't have that information now, we won't be able to tell when we invest in a location, what was the change? What was the outcome? Not just in speeds or reliability, but in pricing and et cetera for end users. Without that, a baseline measure, an intervention, and then a post-intervention measure, we won't necessarily know what works and what doesn't. Now, what I suspect is the rich digital ecosystem of business models, especially the non-normative Comcast, Verizon, super telco, like they've had decades to solve this problem and have not. What I'm looking for is to the innovative, to the local, to the cooperative, to the municipal. And what I want is an empirically backed analysis that can document what works and what doesn't work, why it works and why it doesn't work. We've been petitioning the Ntca since BTOP time. So for me, this is year 12, 13 of begging us to use science to document what works and what doesn't work. This will play out in the immediacy. And we're talking about the next couple of years. In the meantime, however, I want to end with some advice for all of us. Because this has happened multiple times before and the outcomes have been remarkably modest for the underserved in this country, it's important for us to go in eyes wide open. There is, yes, $40-odd billion at Ntca, but there's also all these other programs. Jeremy touched on several of these, but there's a whole bunch that are tucked into these different locations, right? So the Treasury Department has $10 billion that's just sitting there that will be utilized for capital projects. And one of the uses of that is for broadband, and it has a series of different eligibility requirements that most of us would potentially be eligible to receive this funding to get a jump start on projects that might be scaled up under Ntca. The middle mile NOFA, which Jeremy did mention, there's a whole phase 2 of the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund, $11 billion tucked under FCC that's still to be deployed. USDA has funding. There's literally hundreds of little grant programs tucked away all over the federal government And because we don't have a national broadband strategy or plan, it's kind of incumbent then on all of us to kind of identify and kludge together a comprehensive strategy and intervention. And I mention this because, in essence, what's changed over the last 20 years is we now have a lot more tools available for addressing these needs. Unfortunately, it's like you've got this beautiful tool chest that's been dumped out at our feet. Now it's incumbent upon us to find the tools to fix our particular problem. And that is where we are right now. In essence, everyone has to do a bunch of due diligence. And hopefully, I'm hoping that Ntca becomes sort of like the gateway funding, right? That you start there and then you start finding out about all these other smaller programs that are tucked all over the place that frankly may end up being your vanguard funding. That funding may become available far before Ntca funding ever hits the streets. So if you're interested in things like infrastructure, equipment, training, work placement, you're going to need to DIY your comprehensive holistic intervention, and you're going to have to borrow funding from a number of these different programs. The good news is there's a bunch of resources that help point out a lot of where those things are. The bad news is it's still going to be incumbent upon you to track those things down. So and I'll sum up with this, in Pennsylvania, what we are in desperate need of is a comprehensive strategy, a universal service mandate, and in essence, an open access consortia that will interconnect, sure, yes, the big telco gorillas, but also all of these mom and pop shops, the munis, the cooperatives, the distributed infrastructure that's going to be the solution for a lot of these smaller communities. So I'll stop there so we can get to Q&A, because I think this will be very exciting. I put my contact info in the chat, but feel free to reach out after this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, Roxy, and Sasha, for this excellent presentation. I am wondering, Jeremy, if you could get us kicked off with the question that you just put in the chat.
Sure. So, Sasha hit on something that's really important, which is that there's not one pot of funds. Some states, many states are putting, some of the hundreds of millions of dollars in ARPA funding that they received towards their own broadband programs. And I was at a conference, a broadband conference last week in Colorado, and there were some smaller internet service providers trying to figure out, can I get federal funds from this bucket to put in this area? And if I do that, will that prevent me from being eligible for these other funds? Or can I put them together as a match? Or how does that work? There's questions on tax implications. If they receive that grant, is it then taxable? So do they need to hold out part of that grant for paying taxes back to the government? So I guess a general question, Sasha, if you happen to know, or if anyone does, any thoughts on getting clarity there?
Yeah, so because you have no comprehensive strategy, you've got no comprehensive eligibility requirements, and you've got all of these intersecting ridiculous ineligibility problems. One of them, for example, some folks were talking about Starlink. Starlink is a great if you're desperate. I got so tired of all the reporters asking me about Starlink. Actually, I think one of the first people in the region to get it. Set it up in my backyard. I'm part of a global consortium of researchers testing out its capabilities. Better than nothing, yes. Terrible under load. Which is to say, when the network is actually being used, we're seeing as latency in the neighborhood, not of a couple hundred milliseconds, but of thousands of milliseconds. So imagine being on this call and having your packets delayed by multiple seconds. Really bad functional. It's not a functional equivalent for a wireline infrastructure. And Ntca has actually acknowledged this. So under Connect America Fund for Pennsylvania, we gave a lot of money to Viasat in particular and said, well, Viasat's going to just paint connectivity all over the rural regions of this state. It turns out satellite connectivity is pretty poor. And NTA has now said, look, we're going to ignore all satellite connectivity as having capacity that would make you ineligible, which is to say areas that would have been ineligible to build out because they were already served by satellite are now re-eligible for NTA funding. Now, whether that RDOF fund, that fund under FCC, will follow suit, we don't know. That's all to be interpreted by these officials. Long story short, there's just a ton of due diligence that's foisted off onto all of our shoulders to figure out what's already come in here and been funded, what grants are ineligible for this particular neighborhood because they got funding from some other place 10 years ago. This is a fundamental problem of the lack of unifying vision and leadership at the federal level. It's easily solvable, but it requires somebody to say, hey, all of this stuff is great. We like the diversity of programs, but we need some sort of comprehensive strategy to address that. Until that happens, unfortunately, one's going to have to dig into these notices of funding opportunity, talk to, and I would strongly encourage people, Ntca and company, they have a whole staff that's there just to answer your questions. And sometimes they're a little Sphinx-like when they do answer them, but it is a resource that we should avail ourselves of as much as possible. I would say almost always folks are really excited and interested in helping you as much as they possibly can. And almost always the questions that people have are answerable as best as we know if you contact the agency itself. So, Jeremy, I don't know if that answers your question other than to say, yes, this is a hot mess. And this is why the due diligence on the front end is so important, because these grant applications, and my team has done a good half dozen of them already. They are a beast. I mean, that's a lot of invested time to get this through these processes. And I would strongly recommend doing the initial due diligence before you dive into this, because you may find, in essence, you've got a great project, the need is obvious, but for whatever vagary, you're not eligible for one particular pot or another.
And Jeremy, I think this is really interesting considering the work you guys have been leading from Kansas City, the conversations we've been having together about folks being prepared to apply for these grants and all of the work that it's going to take, and even just to grapple with, what is digital equity as opposed to just broadband infrastructure, right? And I'm curious, Jeremy, if you could share a little bit about some more of your plans around, like, what is the digital equity versus infrastructure piece, and also how community foundations have come into this work. I saw there was a question that came up about that, and I think that's just fascinating and interesting to hear. And so I'm going to pivot a little more to your work there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So one of the promising, optimistic things here is when it comes to the digital equity work, we pretty much know at the state level what the state governments have to do. So Ntca laid out pretty clearly. The state governors have 60 days to appoint whatever entity is going to lead creation of that plan. Depending on the state and need, states will get, I think it's somewhere between $400,000 and a little over $1 million to develop that plan. So it's going to be well funded. And Ntca spelled out essentially what states need to put in their plans. And so essentially the short answer is they need to outline the size and scope of the digital divide in their state, and break it down by marginalized population. So what does this look like for seniors, for lower income households, for people of color? And then what's their plan to move forward? There's a recommendation in there for creating an advisory council and lots of community engagement. On top of that, the state digital equity plan and the BEAD, the plan for what they're going to do with the infrastructure funding, those two things need to be linked. And so it outlines a bit of what that needs to look like. And so I think the good news is, well, the challenge, the thing that makes me a bit nervous is that today my LinkedIn feed looks like a job posting board for GIS mapping people, for digital inclusion folks, for broadband directors. There have been numerous state broadband directors being picked off by the private sector. And you know, if you can double your money going into the private sector, building broadband, and you have that skill set, you know, some folks are doing that. And so it's going to be a bit of a challenge in this market that Nathaniel, you know, kicked us off with talking about how tight the market is, and Ashley did. It's the same in this field. And so the opportunity there is that we know many of the pieces that need to go into those plans. And collectively, I think that's where Ashley and myself and Nathaniel and others from the Federal Reserve System are saying, okay, what are the pieces that we can start convening around? We know those plans need to have asset maps. You know, they need to identify who's doing what, so the state plan knows where they can build off of some strong tissue and where they need to plug some gaps in availability. So I think those are some of the things that I see as both challenges and opportunities.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And can you speak a little bit to the community foundations you mentioned? I know that was a
Sure.
specific question, and you know, the question here we have is, what community foundations have invested in digital equity, and what have you seen in terms of how they've been successful in leveraging their dollars or their efforts around that?
Sure. So if you can drop the chapter link back in the chat, I think the way to have the conversation with community foundations, and this came from a community foundation leader from Minnesota, and when she would approach community leaders and or other foundations, she would ask them to consider what role digital inclusion plays in your mission, and then think about how you can tie it to your mission. So in Maine, there's a couple foundations at both the state level and regionally that are working that space. And it could be, you know, giving a $5,000 grant to help a community have a little bit of money just to pull people together to have the conversation about what does a digital divide look like in our community, and how can we go about addressing it. I know of an example also of a bank who got involved for a rural community by through one of those convenings. He was brought to the table and realized they needed someone that can help out with the financials on what a broadband build out would look like. Well, he had that expertise, and it didn't cost him anything but his time to contribute it. And so he was able to provide that expertise. And so I think that's where I go back to thinking about it from, what does the digital divide look like in terms of my mission, and what are the unique skills and strengths that I can contribute? What are the tools in my toolbox that can contribute here?
If I could add to that also, I mean, the community foundations, other funders, municipalities, et cetera, there's a real opportunity for like incredible leveraging of funding, which is to say, you know, when Roxy's members are going after federal funds, a lot of these programs require matches. And sometimes it's like 10%, sometimes it's 25%, sometimes it's 30%, sometimes it's only cash, sometimes it's cash plus in kind. But long story short, there's a lot of ways where especially foundations can be like a vanguard funder into a project. And then for every dollar they put in, they can get like $4 from the feds. I mean, that's huge leverage on this. And the funding realm has been a little slow to pick up on this potential intervention point. I'm hoping that those conversations are beginning to speed up as people have now looked through or begun to read these notices of funding opportunity. But I'd be curious, Roxy, if some of your folks have already started thinking in this sort of how do we get the match kind of tactical ways around this?
Okay, I was muted. We do have a lead program booklet out for our members on how to tackle this, but also I did want to highlight that Ntca does offer communities community grants. And so basically it's this community grant where the community gets to partner with an Ntca member, and that's whenever, like, for example, the member either matches 20% depending on the application, and then Ntca pulls through with the rest because it is a committee led. It's called the Foundation for Rural Service. So that's one of our other arms. And so some of the grant categories, they do vary from like business and economic development to community development, education, to even telecom applications. And so yeah, that's a little bit of everything that we have under the FRS grant program.
Roxy, from your perspective, looking at your members, and I'm thinking really specifically also about rural areas that we serve, rural areas really in this country. I mean, when you talk about your membership and who you represent, how do you think about what digital equity means? Like, what is the equity piece of this that isn't just the digital divide, the infrastructure divide? How do you think about digital equity as it applies to your members?
Yeah, so for digital, when it comes to digital equity, we see it as like the condition in which all communities have access, right, to the appropriate information devices, to even training to participate in our society. Because you can't have one instead of the other, right? They all co-align. And so that's how we see digital equity here.
Ashley, if I could jump in there, I heard someone explain it once that because they're digital equity, digital divide, digital inclusion, they can all sound kind of the same. But I heard it put well one time that the digital divide is a problem we're trying to solve. Digital inclusion are the efforts we're trying to fix the problem, and digital equity is where we want to be when the issue has gone away.
Well said, Jeremy. And I think oftentimes we throw these terms around, I'm guilty as charged, right, in the policy space, without stopping to think, does this definition make sense? Does this track with other folks who are hearing this? I do want to ask, one of the questions we had here was about the pieces and parts of digital equity we maybe don't talk about a lot. And I will say, when I started on this conversation, my background initially is sort of workforce and economic development. And when I came into this conversation, I didn't think about access to devices. I didn't think about digital skills or digital literacy. And I think that's what's really unique about this funding, Jeremy, this digital equity funding. And it's really unique about the conversation we're having. So I'm curious, just across all the panelists, what are some of the best practices you've seen for including those, less common parts of that digital equity conversation? So access to technology and devices, digital literacy, digital skills, adoption, right? I know, Roxy, you talk a lot about adoption, which, right, just building the infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean it gets used. And so I'm curious, maybe Roxy, we'll start with you to hear other folks' thoughts on the full digital equity spectrum of all the other parts of that picture.
Yeah, I mean, can you ask the question again? I guess I'm trying to
Yeah, so the question is, what are best practices for including access to technology and devices, digital literacy, digital skills into the conversations about digital equity or into the work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to part 2 of the digital inclusion series that we pushed out, I mean, this was all based off of, reading more about what our members do, but also enhancing some of their efforts. And so it's more of like, creating those focus groups, right? Whether that's even canvassing, like door knocking, asking the tough questions, not even tough questions, but asking the questions to the community, like what is it that you guys need? Because again, like, we may have the best ideas as providers or as being part of an organization, right? But if we're not asking the community what they want, then like, what's the point, right? Maybe the community, all they need or all they want is to learn how to use the WhatsApp app, right? And if we're not tailoring, that's just an example, right? Our efforts in those, and where are we at? And so just having those conversations are open, open questions with our community, asking them what they want, whether that's focus groups again, canvassing. I know that's hard, as we're here during the pandemic, but just simply having those honest questions, not just going off of our own ideas.
Yeah, and it's incredibly time consuming. It's incredibly expensive to do this work right. And by that, I mean, like, constantly we have seen sort of a rhetoric that says this is really important. Digital equity is important. What we've consistently seen, though, is a downplaying of the necessity of making that a priority investment area. We even see that in some of the funding guidance in the tribal NOFO, which again, we'd already applied to. They had sort of this funding guidance. It was like, for digital equity, we're only expecting you to spend about $2.5 million. Whereas for the infrastructure, it might be 10 times that. And the reality is that's not the way this works. Yeah, there might be some areas where like everyone's got a PhD and is like, you don't need to do this work. But when I'm working with tribes, a lot of time and energy needs to be spent in community with locals, with local groups, figuring out what the needs are, going through, do a full comprehensive, and then sitting with people, often for weeks or months on end. It might not be as sexy as building a next generation telecom network, but it's far more essential for folks in these communities. And thus far, it's still getting short shrift. I mean, the Digital Equity Fund, while great, it literally is only $2.5 billion for the whole country. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. So we need to keep rattling, our sabers and say, hey, look, we need to make this a priority investment area. And the people to do this work are, this is an area where the dominant telcos are a terrible first foot forward on this work. Terrible. It's like guaranteed fail if you try to do it that way. So when I'm thinking about the groups that I'm working with, MetaMesh in Pittsburgh, the Philly Community Wireless Project in Philadelphia, People's Choice Communications up in New York, these are local groups consisting of local individuals who are taking the ball and running with it. And that needs to be the way we do this kind of work. So we created the Digital Stewards program in Detroit, which has sort of evolved, morphed into a lot of the digital navigators work that Ntca is helping support. This is they're putting people on the ground for a year at a time. That is what this needs to look like. And we're still far from prioritizing that kind of major investment at the federal level.
And Jeremy, do you want to build on that? I know I've got another good question in here in the chat from John, but I know this is something you and I have talked a lot about is, how do we get folks in the room who typically aren't in these rooms when we talk about the digital divide, digital equity, digital inclusion?
Yeah. I think on the digital equity piece, one thing that we haven't spoken about is the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is a relatively new federal program that actually provides a subsidy for lower income households to get signed up. But with the ACP program, as it's called, and other programs that would provide coverage, it really helps to have trusted partners in the community that the homeowners or the renters that might benefit from the programs can turn to. Internet service providers, have contracts, and those can be confusing, and there can be some trust issues there. And so I think there's a role that churches and nonprofits and community centers and schools can play in helping to provide clarity. Sasha was referring to digital navigators. That's a huge piece of the work that digital navigators do, is just helping people. And I know one locally in Kansas City that I was recently talking to, and she says that sometimes she might spend 2 hours on the phone with somebody, helping them figure out what plan is best for them and how they qualify and all of those sorts of things. One final thing I would say on the digital inclusion piece is I think it is most effective when we think about deploying the information where we know that people are going to be. So I know of food pantries that provide access information about the ACP. When people are going to a food pantry, they probably need more help than just getting food for the next week. And so I think the more we can think about getting the information to where the people are and integrating the digital inclusion information and resources and tools into existing programs and services could be a really effective way to reach folks.
And I would just add to that. I mean, the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, is kind of a program of desperation. And I support it because I'm desperate and we have a desperate need. But it's a terrible, terrible long-term strategy. What's the exit strategy from a direct subsidy to the ISPs to pay their inflated pricing? Why aren't we having a conversation of, free baseline connectivity? Why aren't we having a conversation of like, what is the price that Americans actually pay? When we did a statewide assessment of pricing for the Pennsylvania legislature, for the Center for Rural PA, we were finding all sorts of what I can only describe as kind of price gouging, specifically targeting rural communities. It is undocumented and needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to dig a hole where we're paying for exorbitant rates we shouldn't pay and can't get out of these direct government subsidies because no alternative exists. We are cementing those business models into spaces instead of creating a meaningfully competitive environment for users to choose from. Again, I'm for ACP. I don't want this to be misconstrued, but that needs to be buying us time to do a far more comprehensive, holistic intervention to address these fundamental inequities.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask, we have 3 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask this. I see John has a couple great questions in here, and this is John Turek at Penn State. So he made a really great question I want to kind of go back to here before we go into our breakout rooms in just a few minutes. We got 3 minutes on this one, but he's noting that, lack of density creates challenges in rural areas for all sorts of things: infrastructure, highways, public transit, water, sewage, right? And so in this new era, it's telecommunications. And the core question is, how can equity in all places be paid for, and by whom? I think it's one of our fundamental questions. To whom does this fall, the financial burden on this? And so maybe Jeremy, Sasha, I know you guys have talked about these a lot. Happy to have you kind of grab that question in 1 or 2 minutes each. Who do you think we should be paying for this to get to this digital equity issue?
Yeah. So I put a comment in the chat. Going back to the 1930s, this isn't the first time we had an issue of trying to figure out how to deploy infrastructure in places where it's not profitable for for-profit companies to do so. So deploying electric phone lines and telephone lines, we've done this, or business models for this. Electric co-ops have access to funding through CoBank, which was a bank set up for electric co-ops, and they can fund a broadband build out over the course of 10 or even 20 years. They don't have the same profit motive that shareholders do. Nothing against shareholders, nothing against for-profit internet service providers. I have a 401k. There's a profit need there. In some communities, it's just not as profitable. And so I think looking at different models. I also think, we know that competition drives down price and it improves quality. And I know, we're one country, but we have a patchwork of 50 different regulatory environments for what it looks like to deploy broadband and what's legal where and who's allowed to do it. In some states, there's prohibitions against municipal governments or co-ops from deploying broadband. And some are getting around that by through public-private partnerships, where perhaps the city or the county owns the network, but then they allow 2 or 3 internet service providers equal access to deploy their service there. That drives down cost. They're competing on customer service, on pricing. That to me seems what part of our country is founded on, is having that sense of competition and everybody gets an equal shake at it. And so that's my view on it.
Great. Unfortunately, we don't have time for another answer there, Sasha, because we're at 11. So this is maybe a great point for us to transition, because we're talking about partnerships. And we are going to be breaking out into some breakout rooms here. And so I look forward to hearing when you come back. We have 2 questions there. We've got them in the chat. What are the resources needed to increase the capacity of the communities you work with to make investments in digital equity? And what are opportunities or challenges for your work? So we will see you in just a second. You will automatically be put into a breakout room. We'll come back together and maybe reflect on some of those things. And Sasha, I'll turn it back to you then too.
All right, welcome back. I am excited to hear what was discussed in the breakout rooms. Kyle Kopko from the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, do you mind getting us started with a summary of your conversation?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we talked about was really related to information. And just disseminating information in particular. So anything from costing models, for example, what does it actually cost to build out? What are the operational costs? Information on installing, attachment fees, maintenance, labor, things of that nature. So even just having consistent information from one community to another for planning purposes, and it was brought out in our discussions that it might cost $10,000, to build out a line in one area and be profitable, or at least that's the claim. But, in another neighboring place, it might only be $6,000. And folks don't have readily accessible information about those types of infrastructural build out narratives, really. Also, not knowing how to get in touch or get information from state stakeholders was something that was brought out as well. I think the importance of proactive communication from federal, state, county office holders, knowing who the important stakeholders are within the communities to ensure equity. Who are those trusted individuals? Like, how do you even get the word out about, like, say, ACP? Because the trusted community members may vary from region to region, and you need to make sure that you have those high quality connections in place to ensure that information is disseminated. Folks know about programming, folks know about opportunities, and without that, they just might be left in the dark. So information dissemination from a variety of perspectives. I'll turn it back over.
Thank you. Yes, as we know, information is going to be incredibly important to help increase capacity to deploy these resources. And so, as a source of information here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, as well as the Center for Rural Pennsylvania and Penn State, I think we are all situated where we have an opportunity to help meet that need. Christy Schmidt from Penn State's Center for Economic and Community Development. Thank you so much for moderating, and I'm eager to hear what your session discussed.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nathaniel, and thank you to everyone who participated in our discussion. We did have some great conversation. Some similar themes came up in our group. And I would say with regard to resources, a big one, again, is that community ecosystem. So, for example, how do community organizations link and connect with each other? So it's a relationship and like a network that needs to exist, or you need to determine where that network is. We also talked a little bit about, like, really a first step might be assessing what needs to be done. So some of the speakers touched on that, but so communities need help with planning, like before they jump into writing a grant. Sometimes you need to know, like, what you need. So that was a topic of conversation. Relatedly, we talked about asset mapping, and another big one is outreach methods. So again, looking for those trusted community partners. How do we identify them? And once there's resources in place, how do we reach people with additional information? So, like, maybe everybody doesn't have an email address in the digital divide. So thinking of alternative methods to connect with people. And then also tracking and adjusting along the way. So, when things don't seem to work, maybe adapting. And then looking quickly at the opportunities and challenges, one that came up is that not every community is the same. I think we all know that, but that's like really important. So just again, identifying the community needs, because each community is different, and also what languages will the information need to be available in, for example. And then we also talked a little bit about spatial challenges, and then kind of like ongoing growth, opportunities for ongoing growth with technology. So, there would need to be like digital literacy resources and education opportunities in place as technology evolves. Community members will need to keep up. So sorry, I feel like I took a long time for that recap, but I'm happy to pass it off to the next person.
That's quite all right. That was a very broad conversations. I'm eager to dig into some of the notes and see some of the details there. And again, think about how we can respond and help fill these gaps. And before we close, there is one more person, Samantha Porter from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the third breakout room. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Nathaniel. I won't be brief because I know I'm standing between some people and lunch. So really to echo some of the things that were already stated around information, particularly around thinking through what are the approaches to community engagement in order to have that sort of targeted approach. What are the needs around digital literacy more specifically? So thinking through investment in devices and partnerships, really strong partnerships in your community to help people once the infrastructure is available, how they can use and leverage those devices for their quality of life, whether that's in healthcare or education or in the workforce space. I think we had a much more in-depth conversation around healthcare, where we looked at a couple of examples around what would be kind of community navigators as one approach to thinking about those partnerships and thinking about the information gathering and really being able to target to different demographics within your community. So if it's older folks, helping them to still be able to gain access to a lot of services, or perhaps farmers who have more and more technology and more devices as a part of farming. So those are just a couple of the highlights, and we really appreciated the really candid discussion, and thank you all so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. Again, thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to our speakers and to our partners from Penn State and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. Please fill out the survey, give us your feedback and input. We'll be eager to hear how the session went from your perspective and what topics we can cover in the future. And please also register for the next assembly on June 22nd. It will focus on regional workforce models. Thank you all so much. We greatly appreciate your time.